Chicago in 1840. A comprehensive historical overview. Chapter 1. The Physical City. Mud, Marshes, and the Great Lake. A town rising from the swamp. In the year 1840, Chicago was barely a city at all. Just 3 years had passed since its incorporation as a city in 1837, and only 7 years since it had been a tiny village of fewer than 350 souls. Now, approximately 4,500 people called this muddy, raw settlement on the southwestern shore of Lake Michigan their home. This was not a city of grandeur or history, but a frontier town carved from swampland, a place of ambition, chaos, and boundless possibility. The Chicago of 1840 would be nearly unrecognizable to modern observers. Where gleaming skyscrapers now pierced the clouds, there stood only wooden buildings, rarely more than 2 stories high. Where millions now crowd the streets, there were rutted, unpaved roads that became impassable rivers of mud after every rain. Where the Chicago River now flows clean and reversed, there was a sluggish, shallow waterway clogged with sewage, debris, and the refuse of a growing settlement. This was the American frontier in its rawest form. The Potawatomi people who had lived in this region for generations had been forced westward only 7 years earlier, following the Treaty of Chicago in 1833. The Fort Dearborn, that had twice been built and twice abandoned, still stood as a reminder of the violent struggles that had shaped this land. Chicago in 1840 was a place between worlds, no longer wilderness, not yet civilization. The name Chicago itself came from a Native American word, likely meaning wild onion or wild garlic, referring to the plants that grew abundantly in the marshes around the river. It was an appropriately earthy name for a place that seemed to be more mud than solid ground, more swamp than city. The unforgiving geography. Chicago's geography was both its greatest asset and its most persistent challenge. The city occupied a flat, low-lying plain at the southwestern corner of Lake Michigan, where the Chicago River emptied into the lake. This location would eventually make Chicago one of the world's great transportation hubs, connecting the Great Lakes to the Mississippi River system. In 1840, it made the city a muddy, swampy nightmare. The land was barely above the level of the lake. In many places, the water table was only a few feet below the surface, and after heavy rains, it rose to the surface itself. The streets became canals of mud so deep that horses could sink to their bellies, wagons could be swallowed to their axles, and pedestrians could lose their boots in the mire. Signs allegedly warned travelers that bottomless mud lay ahead, though such stories may have grown in the telling. The Chicago River was the city's defining feature, dividing it into 3 sections: the south side, the north side, and the area around the river's main branch. The river was shallow, sluggish, and increasingly polluted. It served as the city's sewer, its garbage dump, and its water supply simultaneously. The smell was remarkable, and would only grow worse as the population increased. Drainage was virtually non-existent. Without sewers, without paved streets, without any system for managing water, the city flooded regularly. Standing water bred mosquitoes, which brought malaria, called ague, or the shakes, to a significant portion of the population. Living in Chicago in 1840 meant accepting a regular cycle of chills and fever as a normal part of life. The lake and the river. Lake Michigan dominated the eastern horizon, a vast freshwater sea stretching to the edge of vision. The lake provided fish, water for drinking and industry, a highway for commerce, and a source of the biting winds that made Chicago winters so brutal. Ships from Buffalo, Detroit, and other lake ports arrived regularly, bringing settlers, supplies, and connections to the wider world. The lakefront in 1840 was not the manicured park and beach it would later become. It was a working waterfront, with wooden docks extending into the water, warehouses crowding the shore, and the constant activity of loading and unloading cargo. Sand and gravel beaches alternated with marshy areas where the line between land and water was unclear. The Chicago River was the city's commercial artery. Flat-bottomed boats and small sailing vessels navigated its waters, bringing goods from ships on the lake into the heart of the settlement. The river's mouth was chronically blocked by sandbars, requiring constant dredging to maintain access. When winds from the lake pushed water into the river, flooding worsened. When winds pushed water out, the river fell too low for navigation. Two forks of the river, the North Branch and the South Branch, extended into the prairie beyond the immediate settlement. These waterways provided routes for bringing goods from the interior and would later be connected to the Illinois and Michigan Canal, the great project that was already under construction in 1840. Buildings and streets. The buildings of 1840 Chicago were almost entirely constructed of wood. The surrounding prairies provided limited timber, but lumber could be shipped across Lake Michigan from the forests of Michigan and Wisconsin. Wooden construction was fast and cheap, essential for a city growing so rapidly. It was also flammable, a danger that would culminate decades later in the Great Chicago Fire of 1871. Buildings were simple and functional. Frame houses with clapboard siding housed families and businesses. Larger buildings served as hotels, stores, and warehouses. The most ambitious structures might rise 3 stories, but most were 1 or 2. Architectural refinement was rare. Builders focused on shelter and utility, not beauty. The streets were laid out in a grid pattern, a practical choice that would facilitate future growth, but the streets themselves were simply unpaved dirt, transformed into mud by rain and churned into dust during dry spells. Wooden planks were laid across the worst sections, creating primitive sidewalks and crossings. These planks floated away during floods and rotted quickly in the damp conditions. The heart of the city clustered around the river's main branch and the lakefront. State Street and Clark Street were already emerging as important thoroughfares. The area around Lake Street near the river was becoming the commercial center. Beyond this core, the city quickly gave way to prairie, with scattered farms and empty lots awaiting development. The climate challenge. Chicago's climate was harsh, with extremes that tested the endurance of its residents. Winters were brutal, with temperatures falling well below zero and winds off the lake creating blizzard conditions. The flat landscape offered no shelter from these winds, which cut through the poorly insulated wooden buildings. Snow piled in drifts, and the river and lakefront froze solid. Summers brought heat and humidity that could be equally oppressive. The standing water in streets and marshes bred mosquitoes in astronomical numbers. Malaria was endemic, and summer was the sickly season, when many residents fell ill with fevers and chills. The combination of heat, humidity, and the stench from the polluted river made summer in Chicago a trial. Spring and fall were the mud seasons. Thawing snow and seasonal rains transformed the streets into quagmires. This was when the famous Chicago mud achieved its most impressive depths, when the jokes about drowning horses and buried wagons seemed most plausible. Business slowed, travel became difficult, and residents simply endured until conditions improved. Despite these challenges, people kept coming. The promise of opportunity, of cheap land, of participating in the growth of a new city outweighed the discomforts. Those who survived the climate and the diseases often prospered, and their letters home brought more settlers to join them. Chapter 2: The People. Pioneers, Speculators, and Strivers. A population of newcomers. Nearly everyone in Chicago in 1840 was from somewhere else. The city had grown from a few hundred people to several thousand in less than a decade, and this growth came entirely from migration. New Englanders, New Yorkers, and Pennsylvanians formed the core of the English-speaking population. Irish and German immigrants were arriving in increasing numbers. A few French Canadians remained from the earlier fur trading era. The population was remarkably young and remarkably male. This was a frontier, and frontiers attracted young men seeking opportunity. Women and children were present but outnumbered. The sexual imbalance created a rough society where saloons outnumbered churches, and fighting was common entertainment. Marriage-age women could be choosy, eligible men competed for their attention. The 4,500 residents of 1840 represented an extraordinary diversity for such a small place. Yankee businessmen from Connecticut and Massachusetts brought capital and commercial expertise. Farmers from Ohio and Indiana settled the surrounding prairie. Irish laborers dug the canal and built the roads. German craftsmen established workshops. Each group brought its own customs, religions, and expectations. Native Americans had largely departed following the 1833 treaty, though some Potawatomi individuals remained in the area. The violent history of Fort Dearborn, twice built, twice destroyed, with the infamous massacre of 1812 still within living memory, shaped how settlers viewed their relationship to the land they now occupied. They were replacing one people with another, and most saw this as right and inevitable. The Yankee elite. The leadership of early Chicago came largely from New England. These were men who had grown up in a culture that valued education, enterprise, and civic improvement. They saw themselves as bringing civilization to the wilderness, transplanting the institutions and values of their home communities to the new frontier. William Butler Ogden, who had become Chicago's first mayor in 1837, exemplified this type. Born in New York, educated and ambitious, he arrived in Chicago to manage his brother-in-law's land investments and stayed to build a city. Men like Ogden saw Chicago's potential when others saw only mud and mosquitoes. They invested in real estate, promoted infrastructure, and worked to attract more settlers and investment. John Stephen Wright was another visionary who arrived in the 1830s and became one of Chicago's most enthusiastic boosters. He published promotional literature extolling Chicago's advantages, predicted its future greatness with an accuracy that seemed mad at the time, and spent his fortune promoting the city's development. Such boosters were essential to Chicago's growth, attracting the people and capital the city needed. These Yankee leaders established the civic institutions of early Chicago. They founded churches, started newspapers, organized schools, and created the governmental structures the new city required. Their influence would shape Chicago's culture for generations, even as later waves of immigration transformed the city's demographics. The working class. Below the elite, a diverse working class performed the labor that built Chicago. Irish immigrants, many fleeing poverty in their homeland, provided much of the muscle power. They dug the Illinois and Michigan Canal, the great project that would connect Chicago to the Mississippi River system. They graded streets, constructed buildings, and loaded cargo on the docks. The Irish occupied the lowest rungs of the economic ladder, competing with each other, and with native-born Americans for the hardest jobs at the lowest wages. They faced prejudice from Protestant Americans, who viewed Catholic immigrants with suspicion. They crowded into cheap housing near the canal works, creating the first of Chicago's ethnic neighborhoods. German immigrants were arriving in increasing numbers, often with more skills and resources than the Irish. German craftsmen established breweries, bakeries, furniture shops, and other businesses. They, too, faced some prejudice, but were generally better positioned to advance economically. German beer gardens and social clubs would later become Chicago institutions. Native-born American workers came from farms and small towns throughout the East and Midwest. They worked as clerks, carpenters, teamsters, and in countless other occupations. Some had capital to invest, others arrived with nothing and worked their way up. The promise of social mobility drew them to this raw new city, where hard work might yield rewards impossible in the settled communities they had left. Women on the frontier. Women in 1840, Chicago faced the double challenge of frontier hardship and the limited roles available to them in 19th century society. They were expected to manage households under conditions that made housekeeping extraordinarily difficult. Cooking, cleaning, and childcare in a muddy, poorly constructed settlement with minimal amenities required strength and determination. Many women had come to Chicago as wives or daughters, following men who sought opportunity in the West. They left behind family, friends, and the support networks of established communities. Letters home expressed both the hardships of frontier life and pride in building something new. Women created community through churches, social gatherings, and mutual assistance. Some women operated businesses, particularly boarding houses and hotels that served the transient population. Others worked as domestics in more prosperous households. Teaching was one of the few respectable occupations open to educated women, and the growing population created demand for schools. The sexual imbalance of the frontier gave women who did come to Chicago certain advantages. They could marry well, sometimes far better than would have been possible in the East. A capable, respectable woman could choose among suitors, and some used this leverage to establish themselves and their families in comfortable circumstances. Speculators and dreamers. Land speculation was the driving force behind Chicago's growth, and speculators of all types crowded into the city. The belief that Chicago would become a great city drove prices up, sometimes to absurd levels. Fortunes were made and lost as land changed hands repeatedly, often without any actual development occurring. The Panic of 1837, a national financial crisis, had burst the speculative bubble just as Chicago was being incorporated as a city. Property values collapsed, banks failed, and the economy contracted. By 1840, the city was slowly recovering, but the memory of the crash tempered enthusiasm. Some speculators had been ruined, others had survived and were positioning themselves for the next boom. Every newcomer seemed to have a scheme. Some were legitimate entrepreneurs planning businesses that would serve the growing population. Others were confidence men and swindlers who preyed on the optimism of new arrivals. Distinguishing between visionaries and frauds was not always easy, and many victims learned expensive lessons about frontier business practices. The combination of genuine opportunity and rampant fraud created an atmosphere of excitement and anxiety. Success stories encouraged more migration and investment. Failures were often attributed to bad luck or individual moral failings rather than systemic problems. Chicago, in 1840, was a place where the future seemed unlimited if only one could survive to claim it. Chapter 3: Daily Life. Survival on the Frontier. The Rhythm of the Day. Life in 1840, Chicago followed rhythms dictated by the sun, the seasons, and the demands of frontier survival. Without electric lighting, activity concentrated in daylight hours. Without central heating, winter was a constant battle against the cold. Without modern conveniences, every task required more time and effort than modern people can easily imagine. The day began early, often before dawn. Fires had to be lit or maintained for cooking and heat. Water had to be carried from wells, pumps, or the river. Chamber pots had to be emptied into the privy pits that stood behind every dwelling. Breakfast was prepared and eaten before the day's work began. These morning routines consumed an hour or more. Work filled the daylight hours for most residents. Men went to their places of employment, stores, workshops, construction sites, the docks. Women managed households, a task that included cooking, cleaning, washing clothes, making and mending garments, and caring for children. Those with means might employ domestic help, those without managed alone. Evening brought a brief period of leisure for those with energy remaining after the day's labor. Families gathered around lamps or candles for conversation, reading, or handwork. Men might visit taverns for drink and company. Social gatherings, prayer meetings, and other community events provided opportunities for interaction, but darkness limited options, and most people retired early, rising again before dawn to repeat the cycle. Food and cooking. Food in 1840. Chicago was simple, hearty, and often monotonous. The diet centered on preserved meats, grain products, and whatever fresh provisions were available. Variety depended on season, income, and effort. For many, meals were fuel rather than pleasure, consumed quickly between bouts of labor. Pork was the staple meat. Pigs could be raised on little. They converted scraps and garbage into meat efficiently, and pork could be preserved through salting and smoking. Salt pork, bacon, and ham appeared on tables throughout the city. Beef was available, but less common. Cattle required more care and space than pigs. Bread and other grain products provided the bulk of calories. Wheat flour was preferred, but cornmeal was cheaper and more readily available. Biscuits, cornbread, and porridge were daily staples. Potatoes supplemented grain products, and beans provided protein for those who could not afford meat. Fresh vegetables were seasonal and limited. The kitchen gardens behind many homes produced cabbages, onions, turnips, and other hardy crops. The surrounding prairie offered limited wild vegetables and fruits. In winter, pickled and preserved vegetables supplemented fresh provisions. Scurvy was not uncommon among those who could not afford or obtain fresh produce. Cooking took place over open fires or on simple iron stoves. Without refrigeration, food spoiled quickly in warm weather. Households shopped daily for perishables or relied on preserved foods. Meat was kept in cool cellars or smokehouses. Milk, when available, was consumed quickly before it soured. Ice could be cut from the lake in winter and stored in ice houses, providing some refrigeration for those who could afford it. Housing and shelter. Housing in 1840, Chicago ranged from comfortable frame houses for the prosperous to crude shanties for the poor. Everyone faced the same basic challenges: keeping warm in winter, keeping dry in the perpetual mud, and maintaining some semblance of cleanliness in conditions that made cleanliness nearly impossible. The typical house was a frame structure of 1 or 2 stories, built of lumber shipped across the lake. Construction was rapid and often careless. Walls were thin, roofs leaked, and foundations settled in the soft ground. A central stove or fireplace provided heat, but corners of rooms remained cold, and ice might form on interior walls in the coldest weather. Furniture was simple and functional. Beds, tables, chairs, and storage chests constituted the typical household inventory. The wealthy imported finer furnishings from the East, the poor made do with rough homemade items, or did without. Mattresses might be filled with straw, corn husks, or feathers, depending on means. The poor lived in far worse conditions. Shanties knocked together from scrap lumber housed families in single rooms. Boarding houses packed workers into shared rooms, sometimes with multiple men sharing a single bed in shifts. As the city grew, housing became more scarce and expensive, pushing the poorest into increasingly crowded and inadequate shelter. Health and disease. Disease was a constant companion in 1840 Chicago. The combination of inadequate sanitation, contaminated water, crowded conditions, and swampy environment created ideal conditions for the spread of illness. Death rates were high, and few families escaped the grief of losing members to disease. Malaria, locally called ague, was endemic. The standing water that surrounded the city bred the mosquitoes that spread the disease. Though this connection was not understood at the time, victims suffered recurring cycles of chills and fever that could last for years, weakening them and making them vulnerable to other diseases. Cholera had struck the region in 1832 and would return repeatedly in later years. This terrifying disease could kill within hours, spreading panic whenever it appeared. Though 1840 was between major outbreaks, the threat was constant, and any unusual cluster of illness raised fears of epidemic. Typhoid fever, dysentery, and other waterborne diseases spread through contaminated wells and the polluted river. Childhood diseases, measles, whooping cough, scarlet fever, killed many children. Tuberculosis, called consumption, claimed victims among all ages and classes. Without effective treatments, medicine could offer little beyond comfort care. Medical care was primitive. Physicians trained in theories of humors and miasmas prescribed treatments that often did more harm than good: bleeding, purging, and toxic medications. Some doctors were genuine professionals, others were barely trained. Patent medicines of dubious value were widely sold. Many families relied on home remedies and prayer, with results no worse than professional care. Mud, mosquitoes, and misery. The physical discomforts of life in 1840 Chicago were relentless. The mud has already been mentioned, but deserves emphasis. This was not ordinary mud, but a thick, black, viscous substance that clung to everything it touched. Pedestrians wore boots that rose above the ankle. Often, this was not enough. Streets that were merely difficult in dry weather became impassable after rain. Various expedients were tried. Wooden planks were laid across intersections and along sidewalks, creating pathways above the mire. These planks warped, rotted, and floated away. More planks were laid. Stories circulated of men drowning in mud holes, of horses disappearing, of entire wagons being swallowed. These were exaggerated but not entirely implausible. The mosquitoes that bred in the standing water attacked relentlessly in warm weather. Without window screens, without effective repellents, residents endured their bites and the diseases they carried. Swarms could be thick enough to make outdoor work difficult. The connection between mosquitoes and malaria was not understood, but everyone knew that summer and swamps meant sickness. The smells of the city assaulted the nose. The river stank of sewage and industrial waste. The slaughterhouses and tanneries produced their own distinctive odors. Privy pits filled and overflowed. Animal manure piled in streets. Without systems for waste removal, the city accumulated its own filth, creating an olfactory environment that newcomers found shocking. Chapter 4: Commerce and Economy. The making of a trading center. The promise of location. Chicago's entire reason for existence was geographic. The city sat at a critical point where the Great Lakes water system came closest to the rivers that flowed to the Mississippi and the Gulf of Mexico. A portage of just a few miles connected these two great drainage systems. Whoever controlled this point could control the commerce of half a continent. The French had recognized this potential in the 17th century, establishing a trading post and mission near the site. The portage route had carried furs, traders, and missionaries for generations before American settlement. The strategic value of the location had led to the construction of Fort Dearborn, establishing American control over this crucial point. Now entrepreneurs and officials were working to improve upon nature. The Illinois and Michigan Canal, under construction since 1836, would create a continuous water route from the Great Lakes to the Mississippi. When completed, goods from New York and New England could travel by water all the way to New Orleans. Chicago would sit at the center of this system. The canal project dominated the economy of 1840 Chicago. Hundreds of workers, mostly Irish immigrants, labored on the digging. Their wages circulated through the local economy. Supplies and equipment flowed through the city. The promise of the canal's completion attracted investment and speculation. When the canal finally opened in 1848, it would transform Chicago's economy and confirm the city's importance. Trade and commerce. Commerce, in 1840, Chicago centered on supplying settlers heading west and shipping the products of the prairie back east. The city was a transfer point where goods changed hands and changed modes of transportation. This middleman role would define Chicago's economy for generations. Merchants operating from wooden storefronts stocked goods that settlers needed: tools, hardware, cloth, provisions, and household items. These goods arrived by ship across the lake and were sold to customers heading into the interior. The markup could be substantial, and successful merchants accumulated capital for further investment. The products of the prairie flowed back through Chicago. Wheat and corn from farms to the south and west were shipped to eastern markets. Lumber from Michigan and Wisconsin forests arrived by ship to supply the building boom. Livestock would later become important, but in 1840, the famous Chicago stockyards were still decades in the future. The lake trade was seasonal, limited by the freezing of the harbor in winter. During the navigation season, from April to November, ships arrived and departed constantly. In winter, the city turned inward, its commerce limited to what could be transported overland. This seasonal rhythm shaped business planning and created the cycles of activity and dormancy. Banks, credit, and the economy. The financial infrastructure of 1840 Chicago was primitive and unreliable. The Panic of 1837 had destroyed confidence in banks, and Illinois had banned banking in response. The absence of reliable banking services created constant problems for a commercial economy that ran on credit. Without banks, merchants relied on personal credit networks, bills of exchange, and whatever cash they could accumulate. Eastern suppliers extended credit to Western merchants, creating chains of debt that stretched across the country. When one link failed, the entire chain could collapse, spreading ruin. Currency itself was problematic. Without a national currency, various state banknotes, foreign coins, and other forms of money circulated, each at its own fluctuating value. Determining whether a particular note was genuine and what it was actually worth required expertise that many lacked. Counterfeiting was common. Despite these challenges, commerce flourished. The demand for goods and services in a growing city created opportunities that entrepreneurial individuals exploited. Capital from Eastern investors flowed to Chicago, despite the risks. The combination of genuine economic potential and the willingness of people to take risks powered growth, even in difficult conditions. Land and real estate. Land speculation was perhaps the most characteristic economic activity of early Chicago. The belief that the city would grow, that land values would rise, drove a continuous market in real estate. Fortunes were made by those who bought early and sold at the peak. Fortunes were lost by those who bought at the peak and could not sell. The land itself was surveyed and platted into lots, creating a grid of potential properties that extended far beyond the current settlement. Speculators bought these lots, often without ever seeing them, hoping to sell at a profit to actual users. The gap between speculative price and actual value could be enormous. The Panic of 1837 had brought this speculation to a crashing halt. Land values collapsed, often losing 90% or more of their peak values. Speculators who had borrowed to buy land found themselves ruined, unable to repay debts on properties now worth less than the mortgages. Banks and investors who had lent against land suffered corresponding losses. By 1840, the market was slowly recovering. Prices remained well below pre-panic peaks, but transactions were occurring. Cautious investors saw opportunity in buying distressed properties. The most optimistic predicted that values would eventually exceed the previous highs. This pattern of boom, bust, and recovery would repeat throughout Chicago's history. The working economy. Most Chicagoans in 1840 worked for wages or operated the small businesses serving local needs. The economic opportunities that drew people to the frontier were real, but they required hard work and often years before yielding prosperity. Construction employed many workers. The constant building of houses, stores, and other structures created demand for carpenters, masons, and laborers. The canal project employed hundreds more. As long as the city grew, construction workers could find employment. Service businesses catered to the population's needs. Boarding houses and hotels sheltered newcomers and transients. Saloons served the predominantly male population. Retail shops sold necessities and luxuries. Lawyers handled the disputes that inevitably arose in a commercial society. Doctors treated the sick, with varying success. Transportation occupied many workers. Teamsters drove wagons through the muddy streets. Dock workers loaded and unloaded ships. Drovers moved livestock. As the economy grew, these transportation jobs multiplied, creating a working class dependent on the flow of commerce. Chapter 5. Governance, Law, and Order. The new city government. Chicago had been incorporated as a city just 3 years before 1840, and its governmental structures were still taking shape. The transition from village to city created new institutions, new offices, and new challenges. The young city government struggled to address the problems of a rapidly growing settlement with limited resources and experience. The city charter provided for a mayor, a city council, and various appointed officials. William Butler Ogden had served as the first mayor from 1837 to 1838, establishing the office and addressing immediate needs. Subsequent mayors faced the ongoing challenges of governing a city that seemed to grow faster than any government could manage. The city council, elected by wards, made policy and appropriated funds. Council meetings could be contentious, as different interests competed for limited resources. Should money go to improving streets or building schools? To a fire department or a police force? Every decision had winners and losers made their displeasure known. The city's authority was limited both legally and practically. Many problems required state or federal action. The canal, for example, was a state project beyond city control. The powers granted in the city charter defined what the city could do. Everything else required appeals to higher authority. Law and the courts. The legal system in 1840 Chicago combined formal courts with more informal mechanisms for resolving disputes. The territorial and state legal systems provided the formal framework, but local justices of the peace handled most routine matters. For many disputes, informal arbitration or simply personal settlement was more practical than formal legal action. Circuit courts handled serious criminal matters and major civil cases. Judges rode circuits, appearing periodically in Chicago and other settlements to hear accumulated cases. Between sessions, matters waited, sometimes for months. This delay made the formal legal system less useful for urgent disputes. Lawyers were increasingly prominent in Chicago society. Legal expertise was valuable in a place where land transactions, contracts, and disputes were constant. Some lawyers also engaged in land speculation, using their professional knowledge to identify opportunities and navigate legal complexities. The laws themselves reflected the values and prejudices of the time. Property rights were vigorously protected. Those who stole faced harsh penalties. But the property rights of Native Americans had been swept aside in the recent removal. Women had limited legal standing, and African Americans had even less. The law served those it recognized as full members of society. Crime and disorder. Crime was a significant concern in frontier Chicago. The combination of a transient population, loose social controls, and the presence of alcohol created conditions favorable to lawbreaking. Property crimes, violent crimes, and various forms of disorder kept what passed for law enforcement busy. Theft was common, with many newcomers and few established relationships. Trust was limited. Goods left unattended might disappear. Confidence men preyed on naive arrivals. The lack of effective policing meant that criminals often escaped consequences. Violence was accepted to a degree that would shock modern sensibilities. Fights were common, especially after drinking. Disputes that might be settled peacefully in established communities were settled with fists, knives, or guns on the frontier. Murder was not unknown, though it was taken seriously when it occurred. The saloon was the center of much disorder. Chicago had numerous drinking establishments serving the predominantly male population. Drunkenness was common and socially acceptable among certain classes. The combination of alcohol, gambling, and male competition for status created volatile situations that frequently erupted in violence. Policing and punishment. Formal policing was minimal in 1840 Chicago. The city had no professional police force. Instead, constables and night watchmen attempted to maintain order with limited resources and authority. The night watch patrolled streets after dark, watching for fires and criminals, but their effectiveness was limited. Citizens were expected to participate in maintaining order. The hue and cry tradition obligated citizens to assist in pursuing criminals. Informal neighborhood watch arrangements supplemented official efforts. Property owners took responsibility for protecting their own goods. Punishment for those caught and convicted could be severe. Imprisonment was used, though jail facilities were primitive. Corporal punishment, whipping, time in the stocks, or pillory was still practiced for some offenses. Fines punished those with money to pay. For the most serious crimes, execution was possible, though it was rare. The justice system was imperfect and sometimes corrupt. Those with resources could escape consequences that fell heavily on the poor. Frontier justice could be rough, and lynch mobs were not unknown when formal systems seemed inadequate. The rule of law was an aspiration that reality did not always match. Fire protection. Fire was a constant threat in a city built almost entirely of wood. Without fire codes, without fireproof construction, without adequate water supplies, a fire once started could easily destroy entire blocks. Fire protection was arguably the most important public service the city provided. Volunteer fire companies were the primary defense against fire. These organizations combined civic duty with social bonding, and membership in a fire company conferred status. When the alarm sounded, volunteers dropped their work and raced to the scene, pulling their equipment through the muddy streets. Equipment was primitive. Hand pumps drew water from cisterns or the river, producing streams that could knock down flames if applied early enough. Bucket brigades supplemented the pumps. Without pressurized water systems, fighting a large fire was nearly impossible. The goal was often to create fire breaks by demolishing buildings in the fire's path. Despite these efforts, fires regularly destroyed buildings and blocks. The insurance industry was developing, but many property owners were uninsured or underinsured. A fire could wipe out a lifetime of work in minutes. The constant construction that followed fires provided employment, but represented an enormous waste of resources. Chapter 6: Culture, Religion, and Community Life. Churches and Religion. Religion provided moral framework, social structure, and community in frontier Chicago. Churches were among the first institutions established, and religious observance was expected of respectable citizens. The various denominations competed for members and influence, creating a diverse religious landscape. Protestant denominations dominated early Chicago. Presbyterians, Methodists, Baptists, Congregationalists, and Episcopalians all established congregations in the 1830s. The Yankee settlers who formed the elite tended toward Presbyterianism and Congregationalism, bringing their New England religious traditions to the frontier. Roman Catholics were present from the beginning and grew with Irish and German immigration. St. Mary's Church, established in 1833, served the Catholic community. Catholic institutions would become increasingly important as immigration swelled Catholic numbers in later decades. The Protestant majority viewed Catholics with suspicion, creating tensions that would persist for generations. Churches served functions beyond worship. They provided education before public schools were established. They offered charity to the poor. They created social networks that helped newcomers integrate into the community. Sunday services were social events, as well as religious ones, opportunities to see and be seen. The religious landscape reflected the diversity of the population. Different ethnic groups tended toward different denominations. German Catholics and Irish Catholics might share a faith but establish separate parishes. Protestant denominations competed and occasionally cooperated, creating a complex religious ecology. Education and schools. Education in 1840, Chicago was limited and inconsistent. No public school system existed. Instead, a patchwork of private schools, church schools, and informal arrangements provided what education was available. The quality varied widely, and many children received little or no formal schooling. Private schools taught those whose parents could afford tuition. These schools varied from serious educational institutions to little more than babysitting services. The best provided education comparable to Eastern schools. The worst provided little of value. Parents had to judge quality for themselves, without state oversight or standards. Church-affiliated schools served their congregations' children, combining religious instruction with basic literacy and arithmetic. Sunday schools provided education 1 day a week for children who worked the other 6. These church schools were often the only option for poor children. The city recognized the need for public education and would soon establish a public school system, but in 1840, education remained a private matter, leaving many children, particularly the poor, without adequate schooling. Literacy rates were lower than in more established communities, though this would improve as the city matured. Social life and entertainment. Social life in frontier Chicago was rough by Eastern standards, but provided necessary relief from the hardships of daily life. Men gathered in saloons and taverns, drinking, gambling, and socializing. Women gathered in homes and churches, maintaining social connections through calls and community activities. The saloon was the working man's social club. Here, men could drink, find companionship, learn news, and escape the cramped quarters of boarding houses. Saloons served food, cashed checks, and provided services that modern institutions would later take over. They were also sites of drunkenness, fighting, and other problems that concerned reformers. More respectable entertainments existed for those who sought them. Lectures and debates drew audiences interested in improving themselves. Musical performances occurred in churches and private homes. Theater companies occasionally visited, performing for audiences hungry for culture. Dancing parties brought young people together under supervision. Sports and physical competitions were popular among men. Wrestling, boxing, and various tests of strength attracted participants and spectators. Horse racing occurred when tracks were available. These activities provided entertainment and opportunities to demonstrate masculine prowess. Newspapers and information. Newspapers were essential to community life, providing news, advertising, and a forum for public discussion. Chicago had several newspapers by 1840, competing for readers and advertising revenue. The press was partisan, with different papers supporting different political factions and viewpoints. The Chicago American and the Chicago Democrat were among the leading papers, representing Whig and Democratic viewpoints respectively. These papers reported local news, reprinted national and international news from Eastern papers, and editorialized on issues of the day. They also printed legal notices, advertisements, and the shipping news essential for a commercial community. Newspapers arrived from the East by mail and ship, bringing news that was often weeks old by the time it arrived. The telegraph had not yet reached Chicago. It would arrive in the 1848. Until then, Chicagoans lived with a time lag between events and news of events that modern people would find intolerable. The newspaper office was a center of community life. Editors were influential figures who shaped public opinion. The papers provided a space for public debate through letters and editorials. Reading rooms allowed those who could not afford subscriptions to access newspapers and magazines. Community formation. Chicago in 1840 was still forming its identity as a community. The rapid growth and transient population made establishing stable institutions difficult, yet the elements of community were being assembled, creating the foundation for the great city that would emerge. Voluntary associations multiplied as the population grew. Beyond churches and fire companies, residents formed literary societies, benevolent organizations, and fraternal lodges. These organizations provided social connections, mutual aid, and civic identity. Membership indicated respectability and commitment to the community. Ethnic communities were forming within the larger city. Irish immigrants clustered near the canal works. Germans established their own neighborhoods and institutions. These ethnic enclaves provided support for newcomers, but also created divisions within the city that would persist for generations. The sense of being part of something new and important motivated many residents. They were not just building a city, they were building their own futures. The hardships of frontier life were tolerable because they seemed temporary. The mud, the disease, the discomfort, all would be overcome as the city grew and improved. This optimism sustained the community through difficulties that might otherwise have been crushing.